But the thing of it is, it doesn't matter what blood is running through your veins, but as long as you're kind to each other, that's the main message that it is. Yeah. So, Cecile, thank you.
Yes, I'm glad to be here. And when I talked about what I would say today, I thought I'd say something about Guyana, the history of Guyana, and especially because this year is the bicentenary of the largest revolt by enslaved people in the British West Indies. I'll talk a little about that and my family connection with that. For almost 2 centuries, from the 17th to the 19th, black history of the West Indies was mainly a history of the establishment of sugar plantations by white immigrants, their enslavement of black Africans and their descendants as unpaid labor on those plantations, and the consequences of that heinous system of legal slavery. Those consequences, economic, political, social, psychological, even epigenetic, reverberate to the present day. That history is encapsulated in many a plantation, enormous wealth gained by the owners, rebellions by the enslaved, racism concocted by whites to justify their enslavement of black peoples. All of those aspects are apparent in the brief account of the history of plantation Darfur that I'm about to relate. That plantation on the east coast of Demerara, in then British Guyana, was part of my mother's family history. In 1780, a hurricane thought to be the most destructive ever recorded struck Barbados. The devastation caused 2 young white men, first cousins and descendants of a British Protestant family settled in the island for generations, to seek their fortunes abroad. George Reed emigrated to Demerara, at that time a Dutch colony, and his cousin Richard Reed to Newfoundland, a British possession, and he settled in St. John's, the main town and eventual capital. George spent 20 years as an attorney or manager of a few plantations. At the start, he was one of a group who traded in enslaved Africans, importing many to the colony. Also, for several years, he operated a syndicate with several Barbadians, including Richard, in St. John's, Newfoundland, which exported saltfish to the West Indies. Plantation owners bought a cheap, inferior quality to feed the enslaved. With the profits he had gained, George bought 6 plantations of varying sizes, with a total of around 1,330 enslaved persons. He obtained a mortgage for 2 of the plantations from John Gladstone, father of a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who not only made millions from ownership of many plantations, but also as a mortgage lender. One plantation was Plantation Darfur, which he bought around 1810. It was 15 miles from Georgetown, the eventual capital of the country. Plantation Darfur had been established in the previous century by a Scottish family who named it after their hometown in Inverness, Scotland. Plantation Darfur became the Reed home plantation, where the family lived in its large great house amid its 500 acres and 376 enslaved persons. Around 1820, George retired to Gloucestershire, England, with his family, and with the wealth he had amassed, he bought a mansion set in 70 acres, as well as 541 more acres of that county. He left his eldest surviving son, John Reed, in Demerara in charge of the plantations. Meanwhile, in St. John's, Newfoundland, troubles befell the Reed family there. First, Richard died in 1805, followed a few years later by his widow, leaving 4 of their 7 children still minors. Richard Jr. was chosen to manage their prosperous fish exporting business and be responsible for the care of his underage siblings. Then, in 1815, an economic depression began, and the first of 3 severe winters. Food was scarce, and famine threatened. In 1816, one of the ships of the family's company was lost at sea, and in 1817, 2 devastating fires erupted in business premises in the town. The second fire originated in the family's warehouse on the waterfront and swept through the area. Both fires left 1/3 of the population of St. John's homeless during those harsh winters. A historian writes, quote, "Lawlessness prevailed as gangs roamed the streets, assaulting and robbing with impunity. They were seen daily rooting through the charred remains of the town for half-burnt fish to feed their starving families. Even those with money could find little food to buy. Funerals were commonplace as people froze to death in makeshift shelters or succumbed to starvation." Richard Jr. was now bankrupt and in a ravaged town. In despair, he wrote to his cousin John Reed in Demerara, who offered him a quarter share in one of his plantations, Plantation Nabaclis. Richard Jr. grasped that lucrative lifeline and arrived in Demerara around 1820 to take up residence at the plantation, where another co-owner, Mr. Walrand, and his wife, Mrs. Walrand, were living. Richard Jr. took his younger brother, Thomas, with him, as Thomas left Demerara in late 1822 and enrolled 2 years later at the University of Edinburgh to study medicine, made possible by the upturn in Richard Jr.'s finances. Then, in the following year, on the evening of Monday, 18th August 1823, around 12,000 of the enslaved men on the east coast of Demerara rebelled. There were about 75,000 enslaved persons and about 10,000 whites in the colony. The rebel leaders had finalized their strategy and tactics at a meeting the previous evening at one of John Gladstone's plantations. Heeding the advice of Comina, an enslaved carpenter on the plantation, and a much respected deacon in the nonconformist chapel of the white missionary, the Reverend John Smith, the rebels decided that their uprising would be nonviolent, meaning that they would raid the plantations for arms and ammunition, lock up owners and managers, and force march them the next day to the governor to demand that he reveal the contents of a letter sent to him from the British government about improvement to the working conditions of the enslaved. Some of the enslaved believed it even mentioned freedom. The governor had received the letter a few months earlier, but was prevaricating about announcing its new regulations. Comina's son, Jack Gladstone, some of the enslaved were allowed to use the surnames of their owners, also enslaved on the same plantation as his father, was one of the leaders of the rebels, and it was understood that as practicing Christians, they would shoot only in self-defense. This year, as I said, we commemorate that bicentenary of the Demerara uprising. An artist living in the colony at the time described the following incident in his account, the first to be written about the uprising and published in 1824, the following year. Quote, "About 9:30, when Mr. and Mrs. Walrand were retiring to bed, the manager of an adjoining estate came running into the yard with written information of a dispatch having been sent to the governor that the slaves intended to revolt, and that although the intelligence was not fully believed, he recommended that the arms and ammunition generally kept in the manager's room should be removed to the Great House. Mr. Reed," that's our Richard Jr., "had retired to bed. Mr. Walrand went up to his room and showed him the letter. He told him he was determined to defend the property, and went to the cotton house where 2 overseers were lodged and directed them to the Great House, with what arms and ammunition were there. 4 muskets were immediately put in complete order, which, with Mr. Waldron's fowling piece and pistols, were the only arms they had, and about 60 pounds of ball cartridge. Mr. Waldron directed that they should remain, 1 on each side of the gallery door, 2 should remain behind the door of the hall, and as one fired from one side, he should retire to the door within, and the other take his place. The overseers took the watch. Mr. Reed, Richard Jr., and Mr. Waldron watched from 1 to 4 a.m. Mr. Waldron retired upstairs at 4 a.m. and laid down with everything on. Mr. Reed, in about 10 minutes, called out, "Mr. Waldron, they are at hand," at which time there was a most dreadful yell, resembling a war whoop, the most dreadful he had ever heard. Mr. Waldron seizes his fowling piece and was going to the place to repel them, and saw one of the overseers fire from inside the house, direct from the door. And as Mr. Waldron passed him, a shot was fired from near the door, and the overseer received a wound through the body and cried, "Oh Christ, I'm shot," and immediately fell. He never spoke a word more. Mr. Waldron took his place at the side of the hall door and levelled at the man who had fired from thence. His piece did not go off. The other overseer fired and was shot immediately through the back part of the body, and cried out, "Oh God, I'm shot," and reeled to an armchair. Mr. Reed, on retiring from the upper end of the gallery, said to Mr. Waldron, "It is of no use. We too are opposed to numbers." End quote. No further mention is made of Richard Jr. at the scene. Mr. Waldron, however, rushing to the back steps, shoots and wounds 2 rebels. Other rebels grab Mr. Waldron and drag him down the steps. He begs for his life, especially when he mistakes a rebel standing next to him to be his servant. Prince, will you murder me in this barbarous manner?" The rebel replies, "I am not Prince, but I am your friend. You are a good man, love God, and have not debarred your Negroes from having their church meetings," as was the custom then. Inside the house, Billy, a servant of the Waldrons, rushes upstairs when he hears Mrs. Waldron crying out about the commotion downstairs. She wants to go downstairs and try to placate the rebels, but he pleads with her not to, because he believes that Mr. Waldron and the 2 overseers were killed. As she flings open the window of her bedroom, the rebels below fire, and she's wounded in the arm. She spots her husband lying alive on the ground, and she begs the rebels not to kill him. They fire again and wound her in the hand. The servant then pulls her away from the window, locks her in the room, and escapes. When the rebels rush into the room, she asks to be taken to her husband. One rebel, whom she does not know, assures her that they intend her no harm, that they are only determined to have their freedom. The next day, Tuesday, about 800 rebels gathered near the sugar mill of Plantation Darfur, planning to attack a military post a few miles away. They did not invade the plantation. Open confrontations with the governor's forces were now happening. In any case, Darfur was battened down. A few weeks before the uprising, John Reed had removed 78 enslaved workers from Plantation Nabaclis, where Richard Jr. was living, to Plantation Darfur, and had advertised others for sale, perhaps his perceived troublemakers. Most of the 78, about 2/3 of them, would have been owned by Richard Jr. He could not afford to lose them. What had John Reed suspected, and when did he suspect it? Perhaps a clue lay with his black enslaved cooper, barrel maker Jackie Reed. Jackie was present at the meeting that Sunday to finalize the plot. Although he said he was uncertain about an uprising, he did not refuse when Jack Gladstone chose him to be a joint leader of the uprising in the area in which Darfur was situated. However, next morning, he changed his mind and backed out and remained loyal to John Reed, his master. Jackie was a teacher of the catechism of the chapel. Half of the enslaved workers on plantation Darfur were baptized Christians, and none of them joined the uprising. Moreover, several months earlier, when, in protest at working conditions, a go-slow of production was operated by the enslaved on some plantations, including Darfur, Jackie had pleaded illness for not participating. On Wednesday, following day, Richard Jr. reappeared at what was to be the final confrontation between the governor's forces and 2,000 rebels at the plantation nearby. It was compulsory for all resident whites and free colored males between the ages of 16 and 50 to serve in the militia when called upon. Richard Jr. was standing in the front rank of 300 soldiers, near to the ruthless commanding officer, Lieutenant Leahy, who testified at the subsequent trials of captured rebels that he had asked the rebels what they wanted and had jotted down a memorandum of their demands. Then he showed it to other officers there, and Richard Jr. had seen it, he said. But he, Lieutenant Leahy, had destroyed it as he thought it useless. When the rebels refused his command to surrender their arms, and he ordered his troops to fire, Richard Jr. must also have fired. Hundreds of rebels were killed. The uprising was crushed, and troops proceeded from plantation to plantation, flushing out and inflicting arbitrary and summary punishment on suspected rebels. They found the great house at Nabaklis in a ruinous state, its floors stained and clotted with blood. The troops executed 2 rebels there, the one who had shot and killed the overseers and the one who had shot at Mrs. Walron. Their bodies were decapitated and the heads fixed to poles in front of the plantation. Up to 500 enslaved men and women were killed during the uprising, and in the aftermath, as troops sought out suspected rebels, including dozens who were executed after the trials, decapitated, and their heads displayed on poles in front of the plantations where they labored as deterrents. The only deaths among whites were those 2 overseers, and 3 white employees were injured. After 4 months, about 4 months after the uprising, Richard Jr. retreated to Barbados permanently, where he immediately made a will, bequeathing his share of plantation Nabaklis to Thomas and their 3 sisters. A codicil authorized the executors of the will to pay Thomas £200 annually, about £20,000 a year in purchasing power today, from Thomas's share of the proceeds of the plantation until he completed his medical training. Richard Jr. died in 1831, and in Barbados, and the newspaper The Barbadian reported that the cause of his death was, quote, a lingering fever, the result of excessive suffering during the slave insurrection in Demerara, end quote. He may have been suffering from malaria, but also what is now recognized medically as post-traumatic stress disorder. His mental breakdown precipitated by his experiences during the rebellion, compounding his adversities in Newfoundland. When the British government abolished slavery and compensated the owners of enslaved workers, John Reed received about £40,000, £4 million today, for 3 of his plantations. Almost half of that was for plantation Darfur. He had sold the other 3 plantations over the previous decade. Thomas arrived in Edinburgh in 1824 at the height of the abolitionist campaigns, reinvigorated by the brutality of the British authorities in Demerara during and after the Demerara uprising, and the treatment of the Reverend John Smith, who was charged with complicity in the uprising, court-martialed, and sentenced to be hanged, but died in prison before a reprieve granted by the king arrived in the colony. Thomas's classmate was Charles Darwin, until Darwin, unhappy at studying medicine, left 18 months later. However, Thomas, whose studies were being paid for, and handsomely so, from the profits of enslaved labor, would have been reluctant to befriend Darwin, whose family were strong and active abolitionists. Thomas graduated as a physician and surgeon in 1827 and decided to return to Demerara to practice there. 4 years later, when his elder brother Richard Jr. died in 1831, Thomas inherited a share of plantation Tobacconist, and according to a story passed down by one of his daughters, he freed the enslaved persons he owned. This was 2 years before the British government abolished slavery. By 1838, when the enslaved were fully emancipated, John Reed sold the remaining Reed plantations before emigrating to England, except the plantation house at Darfur. He either gave or sold it, with 5 surrounding acres, to Thomas, who was like a surrogate son to him. And Thomas regarded John Reed as a best friend. After emancipation, free blacks established villages on the land they bought from departing plantation owners. Jackie Reed, that enslaved person who backed out of the uprising, joined them, but was for a while, but was shunned by the villagers as they thought he was a betrayer. Thomas, however, employed him as a gardener. In 1858, Thomas was appointed as the only surgeon to the colony's newly established leprosarium, and was the chief researcher and author of a report on leprosy commissioned by the British government and to be sent to the Royal College of Physicians in London. On Thomas Reed's death, around 1863, his 3 sons inherited the estate, Darfur. The elder 2 moved to Georgetown. The youngest, Robert, fell in love with a black maid in the plantation house, Elizabeth Rogers, whose parents were formerly enslaved on another plantation. When she fell pregnant by him, her parents disowned her, and his brothers ostracized him. Robert and Elizabeth cohabited in the plantation house. He bought his brother's shares in the estate, and they had 6 children. Jackie Reed, that betrayer, supposedly, now an old man, was kept on at the estate. In 1875, Robert and Elizabeth married, and the first child of the marriage, a daughter named Sarah Reed, is my maternal grandmother. Thus, Dr. Thomas Reed was my great-great-grandfather, and Richard Reed of Newfoundland, my great-great-great-grandfather. When Sarah was widowed, she returned with her young children to live in an annex to the then dilapidated plantation house. My mother and her siblings grew up there very happily. Through deaths and diasporas, my mother and her sister inherited the estate. As they no longer lived there, they sold the estate in the 1980s to the government of Guyana. And there's some justice in that the land is now the property of an independent country since 1966, whose foundations were built by the enslaved, their blood, sweat, and tears embedded in its soil. And final coda, Pamina, that enslaved cooper at Jack Gladstone's plantation, that early advocate of nonviolent protest. Now, when I went to high school in Georgetown, the high school was situated on a street called John Murray Street. John Murray was the governor when that uprising took place, and he ordered and supervised such a savage and brutal killings of the rebels. Now that independent Guyana, some years ago, renamed that street Salina Street. Thank you.
Because, you know, like when you research your family, it gives you a picture of where you come from, and it gives you a picture of who you are, and it gives you a picture where you're leading your children and teaching them to. So thank you for sharing that, because that's the first story that I've heard where you've had a white slave owner have a romance with a black slave, and it's actually progressed in that way, because normally you just hear one aspect of it. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We moved from Guyana, Demerara, to the middle of India. Quite a jump. And indeed, I'm very grateful to Rosalind for inviting me to talk about a subject which is very dear to my heart, which is pulling poor people in India out of poverty. I'll just move across here so I can see the slides. Would you move to the first slide, please? Thank you very much. So India is the same size as Portugal, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, Poland, the United Kingdom, Hungary, and the Ukraine altogether. And it's home now to 1,400,000,000 people, of which just under 10% are tribal people. That's twice the population of the United Kingdom. There are tribal concentrations in the northeast of India. Next slide. In the Himalayas and in the southern uplands of India. But more than 3/4 of the tribal population live in what is called the tribal belt, which crosses the centre of India and contains quite a mixture of different tribes. The tribal belt, you can just stop there if you will, Rosalind. The tribal belt is one of the most impoverished areas of India. But what does it mean to be a poor tribal person in India? Well, there's no poverty line because a drought or a family crisis might precipitate you below it, but generally speaking, you earn less than £2 a day, you're persistently indebted, you're undernourished and anemic, and your children are more likely to die before they're 5, and you're more likely to die of malaria than the general population at large. You have no toilet, so you use the fields. You have no electricity, so there are no labour-saving devices. You have no water, so you've got to lug water in a bucket from far away to the home, and you're subject frequently to waterborne diseases. About 3/4 of the people, the tribal people that live in abject poverty, are women-headed households. Women in general, of course, have to grind the corn, they have to cook, they have to fetch in the fodder and fuel and the water, they have to rear the children, they work on the farm to weed and harvest, and on top of that, quite a lot of them are hired labour. They're also generally illiterate and innumerate, and because this lack of basic arithmetic means that they're frequently deceived and cheated by the population, by traders particularly. Many tribals are subsistence farmers. That is, whilst you might produce enough food for a few months or even for the whole year, you've none to sell. And if you can't feed your family year round, then you must migrate to earn income, and you migrate to either a construction site in a big city or you go to a large farm and cut sugarcane. In some areas, 3/4 of the entire village will migrate seasonally, and this of course disrupts entire families, and this disrupts schooling and poses new health and security problems. On the farm, without irrigation, you depend on unreliable and variable rainfall, and you face an uncertain harvest. Indeed, out of every 10 years, 3 years you'll face a complete crop failure and 2 years a partial crop failure. As well as farmland, each tribal has rights to common land and forest, from which before half of their sustenance used to come in the form of firewood, mushrooms, small animals, game, grazing. But today, as you can see on this slide, the forest has practically disappeared and has dwindled. Life then is insecure, a constant battle against the climate, against infertile soils, low incomes, indebtedness, sickness, and lack of services. So many tribals are poor. 20% of them are very poor, with a range in every village from abject poverty to people who are relatively well off. Well, I worked in the tribal belt for about 15 years with social organisers, agricultural specialists and local government, eventually involving hundreds of villages to work out how tribals might escape poverty. The British aid programme and the Indian government provided funds, and we used new techniques and existing technologies to generate early income and to help tribal men and women solve their problems with savings, knowledge, skills, confidence, and the strength of groups. The poverty analysis shows clearly what has to be done, and doing it takes about 6 years, and starts by establishing a rapport with the villages, ensuring that women and those with marginal holdings are involved as well, and getting everybody to articulate their desires and their long-term goals. These discussions flowed into action, and the villagers divided into many interest groups, each wanting to pursue a particular theme, like maize or goats or reducing drunkenness in the village. And they analysed the theme in detail and agreed an approach with specific objectives and identified specialists and group leaders to be trained to take it forward. As one issue was resolved, another was turned to. And for this short talk, I just want to mention a few highlights, starting with ways to increase land productivity. Tropical rainstorms are of great intensity and move soil downhill on the slightest slope. So badly eroded, infertile soil is a major issue on tribal farmland, and it's essential to protect and to improve what is left. Further, on degraded soil, crops can only catch about 1/3 of the rainfall which falls, the rest of it runs off. So you need to work to get more rainfall into the soil and to capture that water which does run off so you can use it for irrigation. Next slide, please. So the first structures that were built were bunds and ridges to slow down runoff, to stop soil loss, and to help the rain to seep into the field. Villagers did the labour, and women were trained to peg out the bunds. Rainfall was also stored in, next slide please, stored in trenches and pits and diverted to recharge open wells. Walls, next slide please, of loose boulders and ponds and dams slowed down the water in the watercourses and increased percolation into the ground. Within a year or two, groundwater tables had risen by 5 to 20 feet, giving, next slide please, most farmers water in open wells. Next slide please. This supply, albeit limited, allowed farmers to grow some high-value cash crops and turned their livelihoods around. And they could also save crops which would previously have perished. The tribal's staple cereals, maize, millet and rice, all give low yields. And national improved varieties which were bred for high input irrigated farming were completely unsuitable to the tribal farming system. However, there are national and international collections of thousands of varieties from all over the world held as seed in cold stores, which are available for breeding purposes, each with its own particular features catalogued. So the farmers and their wives, having described in detail what qualities they would like in, say, a better maize crop, next slide please, a higher yield, for example, a shorter growing period, resistance to a particular disease, or a cooking quality, it's an easy matter to identify from these collections varieties which would seem to fit the bill, and have the farmers try them out and give feedback on what's good and what could be better. And in this way, an immediate yield increase of 50% was quite common. And after doing this 2 or 3 times, yields were increased yet again by breeding what had been selected across with the local varieties and other varieties having desirable features. To grow 2 crops where one had grown before is a good way to increase farm income, especially if the second crop produces, adds nitrogen and organic matter and improves soil structure. Legumes do this, and the short duration varieties of cereal crops which had been selected by the farmers and their wives allow sufficient time and leave sufficient moisture in the soil to allow a following crop of soybean or chickpea. Next slide please. You can also grow pigeon pea in between the cereal rows. Pigeon pea is a slow maturing crop, and the cereal crop is taken out of the ground before the pigeon pea is ready. So with better varieties, more moisture in the soil, and with deficiencies of micronutrients, zinc and sulfur easily and cheaply resolved, crop yields rose up to 300%. All spare land along roads and boundaries and in home gardens was planted with useful trees and fodder grasses. Communal management of the common land brought back woodland, medicinal plants, hay crops and wild animals. A crucial early activity is to start micro-saving schemes among groups. And after 6 months of saving just a few rupees per individual per week, banks are prepared to open a group account and lend money. And these funds, with rules agreed by the group, enable small farmers, women and the unemployed to take out a small loan to cover a health emergency or to start a farm or a non-farm business. Some start tailoring or a small shop. Others raise chickens and silkworms. You've probably not seen those before. The next slide is silk cocoons. Others bought a stud goat of an improved breed, and the resulting milch goats gave 2 to 3 times the milk of the local animals. Others established a nursery to raise saplings. These new incomes were substantial, enough for daily needs, enough to buy a new house roof or to settle a debt. And as the group funds revolve, they become substantial too, and enough for groups to buy substantial machines, like in this case cotton spinning machines or a rice mill. Simple technologies for women reduced drudgery and injury. Smokeless wood-burning stoves, biogas cookers, solar lights, indoor toilets, a transparent roof sheet to lighten the kitchen, ball bearings for the hand grain mill, lighter farm implements than those used by men, well water and plots of fodder and fuel wood, all close at hand, greatly reduced the time and effort of women's task. Taught simple literacy and numeracy, women could avoid being cheated by traders. Markedly less drinking and domestic violence had a key impact. Tribal women suffer astronomical levels of domestic violence from drunken husbands who drink to get rid of their woes, essentially. New income and awareness and new skills in managing a business and in making decisions made women confident and boosted their status and influence in the household. Empowered, they joined and led the various village committees. This young mother wouldn't have said boo to a goose prior to the project, but now just look at her up there and standing tall and describing what's going on. Eventually women ended up using mobile phones to get information and even to sell things. Community resource centres were established, at first to support migrants with identity documents and to help with messages to and fro the village. The centres evolved to provide information about legal rights and government schemes, skill training, and then hiring out machinery and selling seeds. All told then, the crop yields increased dramatically. New wells generated income from cash crops and reduced the risk of crop failure. New enterprises and employment boosted household incomes. With 3 to 6 months more food and a diet with more legumes, vegetables, fruit and milk, there's less child malnutrition and less oppressive debt. Far fewer fall below the poverty line or migrate. School attendance is up. The quality of life is better. People are more self-confident and feel less helpless and excluded. They pull together and have community support institutions with a voice which link to government and now federate with similar institutions in other villages. Thank you very much for listening.
I hope it's been fascinating for you, for all the speakers that we've actually had. As I said before, it just shows that we're all human, we all have a story. Some people go, oh, my life is boring, oh, I don't have... Everybody's got a fascinating story to tell. And when you listen to people's stories, you realise how similar things are and how it goes full circle. Because after slavery was abolished in the West Indies, they actually employed people from India to go over and do the same work as the slaves. So can you see where everything comes full circle? And even with Glenn Parsons, and even though it was later on in terms of World War II, I didn't actually, like as much as you hear about Windrush, how Windrush is spoken about, you think it's like the 70s, 60s, 70s. I didn't realise how far back it was. So I'm actually learning something myself. And another thing, when I hear about Windrush, I keep thinking, oh, that's nothing to do with me, that's to do with the Jamaicans, right? Apparently, my parents and myself are part of the Windrush. Most of the West Indies is not just Jamaica. So it's a continual learning, it's a continual respectful conversation. And as I said, it's not about blaming, it's about looking at history and seeing how we all, everyone in the community, can actually change it for the better for everyone. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you for everybody who's come, all the speakers, and please help yourself, there's more food in there, and hot drinks and stuff like that. So thank you for coming today, that is it, and you've been very patient, so thank you.
Thank you.
Please help yourself before I go in there and finish everything.